it's Girls Camp. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girls Camp podcast. I'm your host, Haley Rawl. Today's topic that we are covering is one that has haunted me deeply since I was a young Mormon girl. We are talking about the Mormon handcart pioneers and more specifically, the Martin and Willie pioneer handcart companies. Anyone who grew up Mormon or intersected with Mormonism at all has likely heard of the Martin and Willie handcart companies. I remember learning about these stories of pioneers who needed to pull handcarts. They didn't have wagons. They had to pull their own stuff with a handcart across the plains to Utah. I remember hearing that they had very little food, that they were very hungry, that they got stuck in a snowstorm, and a lot of them ended up getting frostbite. A lot of people died. These are the details that haunted my young mind. But I remember it always being presented to me as, yes, these really hard trials happened, but ultimately God provided. They found their way to Zion, and it was all ultimately for the best. I had a listener reach out to me and recommend the book Devil's Gate. It's actually called, it's kind of hard to find, Devil's Gate, Brigham Young and the Great Mormon Handcart Tragedy, written by David Roberts. It wasn't until reading this book, I was immediately intrigued because I knew it was telling the story of these handcart companies. And reading this book really shattered the simplified version that I had been taught growing up and all throughout my time as a Mormon. And it was so fascinating learning so much more context about the handcart pioneers, why they were pulling handcarts, why they ended up leaving so late in the season, the rescue efforts, what they actually experienced. It is just much more complicated than I was initially led to believe and has caused me so much reflection on my own identity as someone who comes from pioneer heritage, though my pioneers were not handcart pioneers. It's caused me to reflect a lot on Utah and how Utah came to be, the history of Utah, and also, of course, just on Mormonism. And there are so many through lines throughout this story that happened so long ago in the 1850s that I still see very present in modern day Mormonism and that I still see very present in myself, even after having left Mormonism almost 7 years ago now. So we have much to discuss. First, I want to tell you a little bit more about the author of the book, David Roberts. He is a climber, and he's actually written most of his books about climbing and mountaineering, but he also has an interest in the history of the American Southwest. He died a few years ago, which is so unfortunate. I found myself really wishing I could talk to this man. But he is colleagues with John Krakauer, who also is a climber, mountaineer guy who has also written many books. But John Krakauer is the one who wrote Under the Banner of Heaven about Mormonism and the whole Lafferty Mormon case. So I find it super interesting that these guys were both kind of into similar things, but then ended up finding their way into an interest about some niche Mormon story. I think Roberts is a fantastic author for this book because he has never been Mormon, so he's coming at it from a completely outside perspective. I personally, of course, I'm ex-Mormon now. I found his treatment of Mormonism and Mormon people and even these Mormon pioneers very fair, though he is quite critical, I will say, of the people in the story who I think very much deserve heavy criticism. Spoiler alert, Brigham Young. You know, I'm a Joseph Smith hater to my core, but Brigham Young might be worse. And not that it's even needs to be a comparison. They're probably each worse in their own ways. But man, will this story probably make a Brigham Young hater out of you if you are not one already. Like I mentioned, the version of this I learned about growing up was quite fragmented, often ambiguous. That might just be in part due to my kind of complete and total disinterest in the subject until just recently, which is fascinating in and of itself. But it was very much given to me as a tale of perseverance and resilience and sacrifice for God, and Mormon doctrine, for people to do what they believed was what God wanted them to do. And I never wondered, nor did I ever hear discussed, why this happened and if this could have been prevented, the ultimate tragedy that befell both the Martin and Willie handcart companies. That was never even a question in my brain. I just thought it was something inevitable. It happened. Many of them made it through it, though some of them died, and that was that. And so thinking about accountability, which I would say is Roberts, the author, one of his main goals in this book is to really look at how this happened and if this could have been prevented. It was already such a different paradigm for me to look at this story from that perspective. And it revealed a lot about early Mormonism and Mormonism immediately following the death of Joseph Smith when Brigham Young takes over and everyone is just pushing to get to Utah. There's a song that used to be one of my favorite Mormon hymns that's called Come, Come Ye Saints, and it's a very beautiful melody. The last verse, I believe, of the song says, "And if we die before our journey's through, happy day, all is well. We then are free from toil and sorrow too, with the just we shall dwell." That is such a good example of this weird bypassing of reality, I think, that I, learning about the pioneers, was hearing in their voices through this hymn, them essentially saying, it is worth it for us to die. And we will happily die, in fact, because we know that we are going to go to heaven because we're doing the right thing. And we will see that mentality kind of threaded throughout this whole story of these pioneers and of the people in charge who told them to leave when they did, where it almost just feels like death was not of the greatest concern because they felt like there was something more important, and that was to get to Utah and do what God wanted them to do. And I personally think there are already some major red flags that pop up there when people are saying, yeah, of course we'll die for this, even when death could have been preventable. So now let's talk about what actually happened. I'm calling this the reality rundown. I'm going to lay out as best I can for you this entire saga from people getting converted to the church all the way to when the last members of these handcart companies ended up reaching Salt Lake City. There were a lot of Mormon missionaries that were sent to Europe, mostly to Great Britain and Scandinavia, and they ended up converting thousands of mostly working class poor people. And Brigham Young, the prophet of the church at the time, the second prophet after Joseph Smith, really wanted to get these converts to Utah. Why? Well, there was the prevailing narrative that it was essentially to assure the spiritual welfare of the saints. You know, get everybody together, they can build their own community and support each other in the faith. However, more logistically speaking, and something that I had never heard or thought about until after leaving the church, is that by the mid-1850s, the Mormon church was experiencing quite a bit of hostility from the federal government. This was in large part due to polygamy. People didn't like polygamy, understandably so, and Brigham Young realized that the more people he could get to Utah, there would be more manpower, there would be a bigger economy, a better economy, and essentially just more credibility as a territory. So he was really motivated to get people to Utah quickly and also cheaply. The author, Roberts, says it was widely rumored that the U.S. government, instead of admitting Deseret to the Union, would invade Utah with troops. This was no mere paranoid fantasy on the part of the Saints, for in 1857, just such an invasion would be launched by President James Buchanan. In Young's mind, the best deterrent against such a conquest was sheer numbers. In Great Britain and increasingly in Scandinavia, particularly Denmark, thousands of converts longed to gather to Zion. Only their own poverty stood in the way. It was in this fraught climate of fear and defiance that Brigham Young came up with the divine handcart scheme. One quick note I want to make here before we talk about the handcarts is that I learned that a lot of people who had joined Mormonism in Europe, in Britain or Scandinavia, were already facing a lot of pushback and ridicule for being Mormon. There's a woman that the author highlights. Her name is Patience Loader. She's a young British woman. And she said her parents had joined the church, and she wrote in her journal, "I had found out by my brother that there was none but poor folks that joined their church." Her father, his name was James Loader, was actually a gardener for a baronet whose name was Sir Henry John Lambert for more than 20 years. And when he found out, the baronet, that James was a Mormon, he said, "You either need to completely renounce that church or you're fired." James Loader decided not to renounce the church and ended up getting fired. That's how intense some people's animosity towards Mormons was at that time in Great Britain. Back to getting these converts to Utah cheaply and quickly. There was something called the Perpetual Immigration Fund. This was set up as basically a revolving loan program where the church would front money for converts to travel to Utah. Once they made it to Utah, they would then owe the church back their debt, which they would either have to pay in cash or in labor. So while this seemed charitable, perhaps from the outset, that the church was helping people make it to Utah, even though they were the ones who told people they needed to come to Utah after converting, what it ended up resulting in was that once people actually made it to Utah, they were oftentimes for many, many years indebted to the church and even more enmeshed in the church system because they had to be paying off those debts that they took on to even get there. This fund was actually running low by the time that the handcart scheme was thought up by Brigham Young. And because they didn't have that much money in the fund, they weren't able to keep affording wagons and oxen to get people across the plains. And because a lot of the converts were very poor, they couldn't afford that themselves. And so from this situation, the handcart idea was born as a way of cheaper travel because the handcarts were much cheaper than wagons. Obviously, not having to have beasts of burden to pull the wagons and to feed was going to be cheaper. So it was primarily economic, the reason that they ended up pulling handcarts. Although the handcarts were cheap, they were also very difficult to push and pull. They were very prone to breaking down, and they couldn't carry a lot of stuff because you could only carry as much as you physically could push or pull, which ends up being a really huge contributing factor to the tragedy that ultimately ended up happening. Patience, the young British woman who was part of the Martin and Willie handcart companies, she kept really good journals. So we get to see and hear a lot of her opinions and perspectives on this throughout the book. The author writes, "Patience was disturbed by the indignity of such a means of travel. I could not see it right at all," she wrote later, "to want us to do such a humiliating thing. To be, I said, harnessed up like cattle and pull a handcart loaded up with our bedding, cooking utensils, and have to go through different towns to be looked at and made fun of." Not only was Patience embarrassed by this means of travel, but she was also traveling with 4 other women and then her father, the aforementioned James Loader, and she was really concerned that they were going to be able to handle the physical toll of it with only having one man as part of their party. Her brother-in-law at the time, his name was John Jacks, was a close associate of the European mission president named Franklin D. Richards, and she ended up writing him and expressing her concerns and reservations with travel by handcart. He wrote back to her, and his response, I think, will sound all too familiar to some of us. He said, "It astonishes me that you wish to stay in New York. After you have left one part of Babylon, I wonder how you can think of sitting down in another when you have the privilege of bidding it farewell altogether." The reason that feels very familiar to me is someone is expressing very legitimate logistical concerns and is met with a spiritual answer that doesn't actually address the concerns the person was expressing, and also has baked into it a lot of guilt and shame that this person dare even question something that is apparently divine. I experienced this, I think, most on my mission, though throughout my time as a Mormon in various ways, where, for example, we would be knocking on people's doors. No one was listening. It felt like a massive, massive waste of time. But anytime I even thought that to myself or was brave enough to express it, I was always met with this mentality of just be more faithful and don't ask too many questions and do what God has asked you to do. I also think in this response, we get a really good idea of the mentality of the converts at the time, which was that living anywhere else was like living in Babylon, and only by moving physically to Utah, to Zion, would they be spiritually safe. So you see how high stakes it was for them to make it to Utah and to make it there quickly, and what the leaders were kind of pushing and saying in order to encourage them that way. Because they were pulling the handcarts, they only had a 17-pound limit to what they could bring, which meant that many of them had to give up most of their belongings. They brought a lot of their belongings from Europe, boated across to the States, and then once they got to the handcarts, they had to offload so much. Many of them didn't have time to sell it and just left their belongings, like, anything they could have had, books, furniture, things like that. A lot of practical things like for cooking just didn't fit in the 17-pound limit. And so they just had to abandon them completely. Here's another song that was sung at the time amongst the handcart pioneers. Oh, our faith goes with the handcarts, and they have our heart's best love. 'Tis a novel mode of traveling, devised by the gods above. Hurrah for the camp of Israel, hurrah for the handcart scheme. Hurrah, hurrah, 'tis better far than the wagon and ox team. That rings so strongly to me as propaganda and as marketing. Already at the genesis of this handcart thing, there was this seemingly active effort to be like, what kind of messaging can we put out there to get people on board? And because it was coming from the prophet at the time, Brigham Young, and from Mormon headquarters, of course, the strongest justification for what is a mode of travel that you can imagine people would have some concerns with is, well, it's divine, it's what God wants, and as much as we can push that narrative, then the more buy-in we can probably get. These handcart companies, the Martin and Willie handcart companies, are called that because one of them was led by Edward Martin and one of them was led by James G. Willie, and they each had about 500 people per company. The real fatal flaw of these two companies was ultimately how late they started out in the season. The reason that they started out late was due to a number of delays, some of which were preventable, and also some bad decision making. Most of them did not arrive in the United States until pretty late in the season already. Then they had to travel to Iowa, where they were supposed to pick up handcarts. But the handcarts, there's really no explanation for why this was the case. The handcarts were supposed to be built for them already, but they weren't. So they lost, I think it was 3 more weeks, having to build the handcarts themselves. And because they had to build the handcarts themselves, they were using unseasoned wood, which made the handcarts much more rickety, much more prone to breaking than they already were. That is one of the preventable delays that could have been solved if the church had done proper planning and management and had the handcarts ready for them when they arrived. Local church leaders did debate sending them out so late in the season. There was already at the outset a lot of concern because if the snow came early, the saints would likely be in Wyoming around that time, and it could get problematic. But they felt a lot of pressure to gather the saints, so they ultimately decided to send them on their way. They set out in mid-August, 2 months past when it was probably safe for them to leave. Pretty immediately after the outset, things on the trail were very difficult. The handcarts were really hard to push, and they already had little provisions because of that 17-pound limit. A quote from the author: What was the ultimate rationale for feeding the immigrants such inadequate provisions? In an iconoclastic study, historian Will Bagley declares that the bottom line was Brigham Young's obsessive penny pinching. But it may be that woefully short rations were built into the divine handcart scheme, since the carriages could carry only so much baggage, and the few wagons that accompanied the trains were too full of tents and other crucial gear to take on the burden of additional tons of flour and sugar and bacon and rice. So even before things started to go awry, they were already not eating very much, particularly for the amount of physical labor they were doing. They were walking tens of miles a day, and many of them were pulling handcarts, which, would cause you to need even extra calories. But Brigham Young ultimately didn't want to pay to have extra wagons accompany the handcart company that had extra provisions, mainly because of money. There were 30 children in the company, and early every morning they were sent on ahead of the grown-ups all in one bunch. Some of them had very little clothing, but they all wore hats. They were driven along with willows and had to keep walking as long as they could. No use to cry or complain. But along during the day when it was hot, they were allowed to rest and were given food. They were often 2 or 3 miles ahead of us. It was hard for parents to see their little 5- and 6-year-olds driven along like sheep. That just gives you an idea of, again, even from the outset, when things are going somewhat according to plan, the conditions that these people were under, thinking about the children likely not able to keep up with the walking pace of the adults, needing to be sent out early, and just thinking about how difficult that would be as a parent to watch your children having to do that day in and day out. For many of us, leaving high-demand religion is really just the first step on a whole journey of healing our minds. Do you ever catch yourself wondering, did I say the right thing? Am I still a good person? Or maybe you constantly feel the need to apologize for certain thoughts because you're so guilty just from thinking them. While these thoughts might feel like they're part of deconstruction, and sometimes they are, they actually could be signs of religious OCD, otherwise known as scrupulosity OCD. OCD is really misunderstood. There's these stereotypes that it's simply about being super organized, but it actually can be incredibly devastating and target the things you care about most, including your spirituality, morals, and beliefs. Religious OCD often shows up as unwanted, distressing thoughts about your morals or spiritual choices, or a crushing need for certainty about things that might not ever have clear answers. The distress can feel so overwhelming that it drives you to try to get rid of these difficult thoughts by doing certain mental or physical actions, like endlessly researching religious questions, constantly seeking reassurance, or mentally reviewing your decisions until you're exhausted. While religious OCD can be debilitating, you do not need to suffer from it forever. OCD is highly treatable with specialized therapies. That's where NoCD comes in. NoCD is the world's leading provider in OCD treatment. All of their licensed therapists are trained in a type of specialized therapy that's the most effective treatment for OCD. It's called ERP, or exposure and response prevention. NoCD therapists understand that your spiritual journey is personal, important, and complex, and they will help you build skills to break free from OCD while respecting your personal beliefs and choices. Therapy with NoCD is 100% virtual, and it's covered by insurance for over 155 million Americans. They also provide support in between sessions, so you are never alone throughout this process. If you think you might be struggling with OCD, don't wait. You can visit nocd.com and book a free 15-minute call with their team today. That's nocd.com. Happy healing. There was a very prevalent idea amongst the leaders of these handcart companies and the church leaders of the time that the handcart plan was going to separate the chaff from the wheat. If you aren't familiar with this phrase, it comes from the Bible. I heard it a lot growing up, and it is essentially saying that when there are hardships or trials or obstacles, that is when the chaff, which I guess is like part of the wheat plant that you don't use, will be separated from the wheat, the good part of the plant. And this was used a lot. I heard this phrase used a lot when they were talking about people leaving the church and saying, like, in this day and age, a lot of people are leaving the church because the chaff is being separated from the wheat before the second coming of Christ. Basically saying, yeah, the people who left the church are chaff. They're not, valuable or worthwhile in the same way as the true faithful believers, the wheat, who will stay despite the hardships, despite in that context, the prevalent mentality towards Mormonism in modern day society, which is people think it's kind of crazy. Well, only the wheat, the good ones, will be able to push through that and stay in the church. Says Roberts, this vein of righteousness, which Brigham Young himself was wont to employ in his speeches in Salt Lake City, readily produced a kind of circular argument. Whoever dropped out or even showed faintness of heart was judged to have been morally deficient from the start. Another fallacy, or as the author said, circular argument that I see all the time in the ex-religious space is, well, if you left the church or if you left Christianity, you must have just not been a very good Mormon or a very good Christian to begin with. There's a name for it. I think it's the no true Scotsman fallacy, and this sounds very similar. It's very convenient because if there are detractors, people who ultimately couldn't hack doing the handcart way of travel or speak up against it and have concerns enough to leave, then it's like, oh, they're just not faithful enough and they never were anyway. And it doesn't actually reflect at all on the thing, the handcart plan. It just reflects on the person and their lack of faith. As evidence of this type of thinking, like playing out in practicality, this is a journal entry from a member of the Handcart Company's journal. And they had written, Saturday, September 13th, a sister, Mary Mayo, died of dysentery. She had little faith and had grumbled much. Age 65. So Sister Mary Mayo dies of a disease of dysentery. And they're like, yeah, but, she wasn't all that faithful anyway. And she grumbled much. A 65-year-old woman walking her way across the plains, trying to make it to Utah like she was told to do. But when she dies of dysentery, it's because she had little faith to begin with. They made it with their handcarts from Iowa to Florence, Nebraska after a few weeks. That's like the very first leg of the trail. And in Florence, people were becoming increasingly concerned about the lateness of the season, and they were wanting to winter over in Florence instead of pushing on. They had a series of meetings where they were discussing this dilemma. And there was a man named Levi Savage Jr., who was a member of the Willie Company, and he was pushing really hard to winter over in Florence. He said he knew that leaving so late in the season would ultimately result in sickness, starvation, and death. But when he spoke up and said that, he ended up being rebuked by church leaders as well as some fellow travelers for lacking faith. He stood by his warning. He didn't take it back, but he said he would still go with them and, quote, stand by them even unto death, which ended up proving all too accurate. Also, while in Florence, a member of the company named John Oakley ended up debating with detractors and people who were living in Florence who were kind of appalled by this whole handcart situation. He said, "One said to me, God never required such hard things as drawing a handcart." Oakley had a ready rejoinder. I told him he had not read his book right. He required his only begotten to do a harder thing than draw a handcart. Another type of messaging that feels all too familiar, which is no matter how hard the thing is, it's not as hard as the thing that God asked Jesus to do when Jesus died on the cross. And so therefore, you should shut the fuck up and do what you've been asked to do. Because when everything is put in comparison with what Jesus was asked to do, then there's really no reason for complaining, which I find very problematic. And again, a very convenient way to get people to stop complaining about legitimate concerns and make them feel shitty for complaining about legitimate concerns in the name of Jesus and the sacrifice that Jesus apparently made. Not even to mention, no one asked for Jesus to do the thing he did, right? And even if you're a believer, I'm no longer a believer in Jesus and the atonement, but still it would be like telling someone, well, Jesus did this thing that nobody even asked for, and because he did that hard thing, then anything in comparison is easy compared to that, so you should be able to do pretty much anything. In the end, about 100 members of the handcart companies combined decided to stay in Florence for the winter. Some of them ended up pushing on to Utah the next year. Some of them just ended up living in Florence and leaving the church. Lucky ones. But about these backouts, the people who chose to leave and not push on, a man named Millen Atwood later sneered, "Those who were good for nothing left us at Florence." So they were good for nothing anyway, apparently. They're very behind schedule, but on the handcart companies go, and they're able to travel across Nebraska. It's tough, but it's manageable, but it's also very, very slow. And by late September, they reach Fort Laramie. This is in Wyoming, and they were expecting at Fort Laramie a resupply of provisions because the food is running really low. This is where shit really starts to hit the fan. I feel like this is the moment in this story where things begin to get dire because church leaders had not sent supplies that year to Fort Laramie. When they got there were no supplies for them, and there was also nothing they could buy. They didn't really have money anyway to buy things, but there was no way to get more food or provisions. David Roberts says, "The failure of the Fort Laramie resupply has never been adequately explained. Historians struggle to come up with an explanation less damning than sheer negligent indifference." Basically, we don't know why the supplies did not make it to Fort Laramie. There is also speculation. A reason could be that because the handcart plan was so cheap, they also thought that it would be self-sustaining. Like they didn't realize that they would need resupply at that point. But because of all of this, because there is no resupply, they end up having to cut their rations, which were already quite small, in half to about 12 ounces of flour per adult per day. By early October, the members of the handcart company are starving. It is very cold, and it begins to snow. So with the freezing weather and their weakened bodies, many people begin to succumb to disease, to collapse just due to exhaustion, and deaths start happening more frequently. There are also a lot of river crossings along this journey where people have to just push their handcarts through the river. And so you can imagine when it's already freezing cold, the water is freezing cold, and then you're having to walk through freezing cold water, push a handcart through cold water, which is very difficult and very dangerous. So that's also adding a huge element of why people are getting so sick and so exhausted. There was a infamous crossing by the Martin Company of the North Platte River, and it was during a blizzard. There's ice in the water, it's blizzarding outside, but they make it to this river and there's nothing to do but simply cross the river. And many after that river crossing died from exposure to the cold and also to starvation. It's at this point that word finally makes it to Brigham Young in Salt Lake City that there are handcart companies still on the plains, and they are out there weeks later than they should have been. Until then, most people in Utah assumed that they had all made it safely across. I guess they didn't realize how many people were still out there, which seems like a major miscommunication. I know these are different times. I'm not sure how accountable you can hold people for the communication, I guess, but it does seem like there was some amount of negligence there that they didn't even know that these really large groups of people were still making their way toward Utah. Brigham Young, to his credit, I suppose, upon hearing that there were these handcart companies still out there in October, immediately started assembling a rescue team to go and help out the company, resupply them with food, with clothing, and things like that, and help them make it to Salt Lake City. Roberts says, "The response to the rescue appeal on the part of the rank-and-file saints was extraordinary. Despite the crop failures of the previous year, the faithful readily donated the tons of flour Young had specified. They also offered horses and mules, wagons, and all kinds of warm clothes and bedding. And there was no shortage of volunteers. In the prophet's formula, good young men who know how to drive teams to set out almost at once on the return trail. 6 of the volunteers, in fact, came from the Richards party, who spent only a few days in Salt Lake before heading east again." So there was another party, the Richards party, who had just arrived in Salt Lake City and had crossed the plains with wagons, and they were only in Salt Lake for a few days before deciding to join the rescue effort to head back and help the handcart companies. I left a note here because I highlighted the hell out of this book on my Kindle, but I only ended up leaving one note the entire book. And I said, the best part has always been the people. I was really touched by hearing about that immediate response on behalf of the members in Salt Lake City and how quickly they responded, knowing that people were in need and donated their own things, even though it seems like many of them didn't have much extra of their own. And despite the complexity of the fact that these people had joined the church and were part of the church, though I think that there's a lot to be said there about manipulation and being duped and things like that. It's complex, but ultimately I think the people, the members, are the best part of the church in a lot of ways, not all of them, but many times. And it's the leadership that I really point the finger of blame to. And I think being able to see how members were willing to show up in that circumstance was such a good example of that. Robert says, only after desperate news arrived did leaders mobilize aid. It also cemented the mythic heroism of the rescue in Mormon memory, emphasized in faith-promoting retellings, often more than the leadership failures that caused the crisis. So even though Brigham Young did respond when he found out that the companies were still out there, the reasons that they were out there were because of Brigham Young's pressure to get people to Utah. So the rescue response, in my opinion, is kind of like, yeah, that's like the least you can do is go help rescue these people who you've told to come to Utah, who you've set up for failure essentially through the handcarts and the amount of baggage they can bring through not resupplying them with provisions. But yet this juncture of the story is often like, yay, Brigham Young went to rescue the saints in record time. But really, it was mostly his fault to begin with. The rescuers ended up reaching the Willie Company about 2 weeks after Brigham Young heard the news, and the Martin Company they reached about 5 weeks later. And most of the horror of this situation actually happened within the time that the rescuers were sent out and they actually found these companies. As you can imagine, it's kind of a difficult thing to do because of lack of communication. The rescuers didn't know exactly where they were, and they were also far away and traveling on horseback. So it took quite a bit of time for them to reach these companies that were already in a very precarious position. So what was it like during this time for the pioneers? I pulled a lot of snippets, kind of short story vignettes from the book. The author did a fantastic job of really painting a picture, oftentimes through the own words of the pioneers who experienced this, of what they were going through. So I'm just going to start reading through some of these. One of the pioneers wrote, "How good the soup tasted made from the bones of those cows, although there wasn't any fat on them. The hides we used to roast after taking all the hair off of them. I even decided to cook the tatters of my shoes and make soup of them. It brought a smile to my father's sad face when I made the suggestion, but Mother was a bit impatient with me and told me that I'd have to eat the muddy things myself." The hunger was that intense that people were eating their own shoes, cooking their own leather shoes. Sometimes only brutal treatment kept the weakest saints from giving up. Anne Rowley witnessed an instance involving her 10-year-old son. "I watched John, so cold, drowsy, and sick, want to lie down in his tracks, never to rise again. I had to stand helplessly while Captain Willie whipped him to make him go on. Gladly would I have taken the whipping myself." These people were so incredibly exhausted. I mean, you have women, children, elderly people, and oftentimes the more able-bodied people, the men of the groups, were the ones who were actually pulling the handcarts. Sick people would have to get in the handcarts, and so there was a lot of added weight when more and more people were getting sick that they had to pull. And in order to just keep people going, which I can understand that people needed to keep moving, but in order to do that, oftentimes these tactics were used of literally whipping people, yelling at people to make them continue on because the party couldn't just wait. Elizabeth Sermon would later claim the food rations were reduced to 1/4 pound per adult and 2 ounces for the children per day. Starvation to us, but not so to the captains. By our going around camp at night, where cooking pots of some of the captains could be seen, they looked pretty full and smelled quite savory. In fact, the captains fed well while we drank ours in porridge, for I could not make bread with the small allowance of flour. No other diary or reminiscence, however, corroborates this aspersion. So the author couldn't find any other people who were claiming that the captains were eating quite well while the rest of the company was literally starving to death. But Elizabeth Sermon did claim it was so. And it was interesting. The author did lay out recollections from people who had stayed in the church and from people who had left the church. And he always pointed out, okay, this person said this about the experience, but they ended up leaving the church. This person said this, but they ended up staying. Just pointing out how, where people ended up when they are now remembering these things could maybe affect their perception or the things that they said. So we don't know for sure if that was the case, but if it was, how incredibly awful that the captains were eating so well while the women, the children, the elderly were eating their own shoes. When morning came, Father's body, along with others who had died during the night, were buried in a deep hole. Brush was thrown in and then dirt. A fire was built over the grave to kill the scent, to keep the wolves from digging up the remains. Death was happening almost every night. People would wake up in the morning and see who had died in the night, and they didn't have time for proper burials. They would just dig graves as deep as they could and then bury people and hope that the wolves wouldn't dig them up, although oftentimes they did because of how difficult it was to dig graves in such cold ground. There was even a story of two men who were digging a grave for the dead, and then right after digging that grave, before they could move on, they died and a new grave had to be dug for them. That's how much death was happening. And just thinking about living amongst that much death, being in such dire straits yourself, but just not knowing who was going to die next, and knowing that, it could be one of your family members, it could be you. Just thinking about the children having to experience that much death at that young age, having close loved ones die, and it just being like, throw them in the grave and we just got to keep going. It's really, really heavy. Speaking of that lack of time to even properly grieve, this is a story that someone is telling about their mother after their dad had just died. Mother sat on a large kettle turned upside down, weeping bitterly. I and 9-year-old brother Anthony stood beside her, not knowing what to do. One of the men who was helping to manage the company came along just then and had a walking stick in his hand. He struck Mother across the back with his stick and said in a sharp voice, "Get up and go on. You cannot sit here crying. We have to go on at once or we will all die." Oh, how I wished I were a man so I could fight for my mother. I never forgave this man. Now in my late years, as I look back, I see things more clearly, and I see that sternness was our only salvation and the only thing we could stand, as it roused us from our misery. Interesting to hear not only what it felt like then as he watched his mother get yelled at after her husband had just died, but then to hear this person reflecting on it and kind of making this justification, whether warranted or not, that it was all for the best, that was what was needed to be done, because had they taken time to grieve, they probably would have just died. Like, they had to be forced to move on, and that was apparently the only way to force them forward. This happened in the same family. As if the loss of her husband were not tribulation enough, Elizabeth's 6-year-old son, Robert, now had severely frostbitten feet. As she would recall, I had to take a portion of poor Robert's feet off, which pierced my very soul. I had to sever the letters with a pair of scissors. Little did I think when I bought them in Old England that they would be used for such a purpose. Every day some portion was decaying until the poor boy's feet were all gone. Frostbite was a major thing that many of these people were battling during this time because they didn't have proper shoes, they didn't have proper clothing, they were sleeping. That was another issue with the handcart plan, is when there were wagon companies that came over in wagons, they could sleep in the wagons. So they were off the ground, there was some sort of shelter, where with the handcarts, they were not off the ground when they were sleeping, so it was much colder. They had to put up tents, which weren't as good of shelter as the wagons. And so a lot of people had a lot of exposure to the cold, which led to a lot of frostbite, which frostbite just sounds so awful. So awful. I actually just read John Krakauer's Into Thin Air about the disaster tragedy on Everest, where a lot of people died up on Everest. I think it was like the deadliest couple days in the history of Everest. And there was a member of the party who ended up getting super severe frostbite on their face, and they actually ended up like losing their nose. And frostbite just sounds really, really so horrific, especially when there's no medical care, and the best medical care at hand is a mother with her pair of scissors. Rescuers finally ended up reaching these companies, and there was a lot of time in this limbo between the rescuers being sent to the companies where they didn't know if they should keep moving forward because they were getting stuck by snow. That's why this book is called Devil's Gate. That was a place they got stuck during one of these snowstorms where they had to just wait for a couple days because they couldn't move on. But they were in this really difficult situation because they didn't know who was going to save them and when. So they were doing their best to keep pushing on, but they were exhausted. Their food had almost completely run out, and the rescuers ended up reaching them. I wouldn't even say in the nick of time because people had already died and people were already on the brink of death that couldn't be brought back even after the rescuers came. More saints in both the Willie and Martin companies died after the rescuers reached them than during all the previous weeks of their trek from Iowa City to western Wyoming. It is a powerful testimony to how memory reshapes events that several of the Willie saints later wrote about the crossing of Rocky Ridge and the mass interment in camp the next day as if both had happened before the arrival of Grant's rescue team. Whatever aid and sustenance Kimball, Allred, and the other men with the rescue wagons were able to render, it was not enough to save those 15. So even after the rescuers met the parties, of course, there was only so much that the rescuers themselves could have to resupply them. And then they were able to like connect getting more supplies and more help to them. But even after the rescuers reached them, there was more deaths than before the rescuers reached them just because of how starving and sick and cold the people had become in the time it took for the rescuers to get there. By the time the last handcart pioneers straggled into Salt Lake on November 30th, they had left some 220 of their brothers and sisters dead on the trail. Consequently, the Mormon handcart tragedy of 1856 remains the greatest disaster in the whole pageant of westward migration across America. I did not realize that. I did not realize that, thinking of the westward migration across America, as David Roberts so beautifully puts it, that is a massive piece of the history of the United States. And to think that this was the most disastrous of anything that happened in that period of history along that trail is just really impactful. And I think it also caused me to realize how interesting this story is just as a matter of history, even beyond the Mormonism stuff, because of that, because it was such a disastrous and tragic situation. I'm sure that many of you have heard of the Donner Party. That is another party that was traveling west. They ended up getting snowed in somewhere and they ended up resorting to cannibalism. I'm actually really interested in that now. That might be my next topic I deep dive into is the Donner Party. There's not a Mormon connection there, but I feel like that's a really well-known situation, maybe because of the cannibalism stuff that like sticks in people's minds more. But it feels like the Martin Willie Handcart Company stuff is not as well-known beyond Mormonism. And I wonder how much of that is due to Mormons kind of taking the narrative, sweeping certain things under the rug. Obviously, it's not a great look to have one of the greatest disasters in that period of history. So I feel like the Mormon Church has done a really good job of sort of covering that up and twisting the narrative in a way that even people outside of the church, it seems like, aren't talking about this as much as I wonder if they would be otherwise. Speaking of that narrative twist, which the Mormon Church really likes to do, David Roberts says, the conclusion is inescapable. The Mormon catastrophe of 1856 remains far and away the most deadly in the history of westward migration in the United States. At once, however, the propaganda machine of church publications began to cover up the disaster. Only 4 days after the Martin Company's arrival, the Deseret News acknowledged, as was to be expected, they have suffered considerably from storms and inclement weather, and several have had their feet and hands more or less frosted, but are now comfortably housed and cared for. But the Lord was watching over even this ill-fated caravan of saints, for we can plainly recognize the kind hand of an overruling providence in opening a way of escape for so many. Meanwhile, let's talk about this young girl named Nellie. Nellie crossed over. She made it to Utah, so she got there. However, nothing could be done to save her feet because she had such severe frostbite that when they took off her socks and shoes, pieces of flesh and skin actually came off with her socks and shoes. They ended up ultimately having to amputate her feet. They didn't give her an anesthetic, and the surgery was performed with a butcher's knife and a carpenter's saw, which they used to cut her limbs off. And it was a very poor surgery, for the flesh was not brought over to cushion the ends. So the bones stuck out through the ends of the stumps, and she was in pain for the entire rest of her life because of that. And she lived to old age. She had children, but she was in severe pain because of how poor the amputation was and because she had experienced such severe frostbite. So I think looking at that story, which is one of many, many stories of the fallout of even the survivors of these handcart companies, and then looking at how it was presented in the official church publication, just goes to show how much really was swept under the rug and how quick they were just to be like, yeah, there was some frostbite, but God got them through, and how lucky they are for that. When Brigham Young caught wind of the fact that people were beginning to blame him, as these pioneers made it into the community and were kind of sharing what had happened to them, people started to express concern that this had happened, and they were starting to think that Brigham Young might be to blame. Brigham Young said, "If any man or woman complains of me or of my counselors in regard to the lateness of some of this season's immigration, let the curse of God be on them, and blast their substance with mildew and destruction until their names are forgotten from the earth." Casual. Let's just blast their substance with mildew and destruction and get their names forgotten from the earth. If anyone so much as stops to consider who might be accountable for the level of tragedy and death that these people experienced, this seems very true to Brigham Young form. He seems very much like a dictator who was completely unwilling to take any accountability, who was always trying to push off the blame, and even said directly, like, if you blame me, you're going to go to hell, basically. To add insult to injury, even 22 years later, after these people had arrived in Utah, the church was still trying to collect from these people the debt that they owed to the Perpetual Immigration Fund that I mentioned earlier, the fund that fronted some of the cost for these people to make it to Utah. 22 years after the fact, the church was still hounding these people down to try and get them to pay back what they owed for having gone through all of that. There was a detractor who ended up speaking out against that. He had left the church and he was like, fuck this, that you're trying to get people to still pay you back. And the church didn't issue a formal apology or anything like that. But I think they slowly, quietly kind of fizzled that out. So they didn't end up collecting their dues from all of the members of the handcart company because of that detractor, luckily. But had that person not said something, who knows? They were still very much trying to get their debts paid back. I really like how Roberts, the author, put this. He said, "The courage and perseverance of most of the handcart saints are beyond question. Some of them, as well as some of the rescuers, emerged from the ordeal as genuine heroes. What seems to have been lost in the myth-making is the fact that those saints were also victims, and not of some domino topple of impersonal causes, but of colossal mismanagement and negligence on the part of LDS leaders." That sums it up really perfectly to me. And I think it speaks to some of the complexity I was mentioning before of, what is the accountability of the people who agreed to do this, of the converts who agreed to come and agreed to be part of this. Ultimately, I think they did the best with what they had and what they knew, most of them, and they were victimized by the church leadership who used spiritual manipulation tactics to get them to do these things and then set them up for failure in such a massive way. I was always under the impression that everyone, I guess, stayed in the church, so I clearly didn't have all the context in a much bigger way, but especially the pioneers and the handcart pioneers, because of the way this narrative was presented to me, I just always thought that, yeah, once they made it to Utah, of course they were devout Mormons for the rest of their lives. But actually, among all of the people who came to Utah during the pioneer years, so this is not just the handcart companies, it's difficult to tell, it's difficult to keep track, but 1/3 ended up leaving the church of the pioneers who came to Utah, which that's a lot of people. 1/3 of the people who had sacrificed all of that to come to Utah ended up leaving the church. And here I was thinking that none of the pioneers would have ever left the church, but I think a lot of people just, the way that people are still to this day, probably figured out some things and saw through some things. And even after having done all of that, they left the church. Some of them went all the way back to their home countries. Imagine like getting converted in England, making your whole way to Utah and then being like, oh, this is bullshit. And then having to make your way all the way back to England or to Scandinavia. I do not envy those people, though I respect them for not giving in to the sunk cost fallacy and just being like, nah, I may as well get out of here. After the author tells that entire tale, which, by the way, there is so much more there. I feel like I just covered broad strokes and then the anecdotes that really stood out to me, but I strongly recommend reading this book. I learned so much. There is so much in there about Brigham Young and when he became prophet of the church. The author even gives a really good background history of all the Joseph Smith stuff where I learned a lot. Even the story of these handcart companies, there are so many twists and turns, so many different characters that I really couldn't get into it all. So, like I said, I strongly recommend reading the book. After the author tells all of that, he gives us a little insight into what it was like for him to be doing the research for this book, to be piecing all of this together. And I found this one of the most interesting parts of the book to read because I got to hear what it was like for someone who had learned so much about this event to then see how the Mormons made sense of it, like current active Mormons, and to then hear how he made sense of all of the different facets of this story. And he actually ended up visiting the trail that the Mormons took to make it to Utah. And along that trail are multiple different points where there are museums that the church has set up, like at Devil's Gate, Martin's Cove area, which is where a lot of the most intense suffering of those people took place. There are church museums and outposts that are usually manned by missionaries, by elders and sisters, young ones, the young missionaries, as well as like senior missionaries. And he goes and visits these sites after having found all of this out. And reading about him processing all of that was really validating as an ex-Mormon. It was validating because it's such a weird, difficult thing to process, especially with all the connections I have to it. So seeing that for an outside party, there was a lot of reckoning and processing to do, I found very validating. After visiting one of these museums along the trail, I believe in Wyoming, he says, I was beguiled and puzzled. I also love just the way this author writes. He's a really, really good writer. I learned a lot of words reading this book. I was beguiled and puzzled by the medley of pious obfuscation and frank admission of suffering that the museum presented. A glass case holding a day's ration of flour made vividly clear how little food the saints were forced to subsist on. One caption granted, children chewed rawhide to quiet their pains of hunger. Yet the rescue came across as a deus ex machina. But President Young was true to his word. Martin Handcart Company found and saved. That's such a little microcosm of what I was trying to explain before, which is like the way that I was told all of this was, it was so awful. Think about being so hungry that you have to chew cowhide. But then they were saved by Brigham Young, and all was well in the end. To the Come Come Ye Saints song, actually, happy day, all is well. That's like kind of the whole point of the song, is like, it's okay though, all is well, because the Mormon church is true and therefore we're doing the right thing. It's a very weird dichotomy, a very weird balance that the church is trying to walk between, no, this was really awful, and we want you to feel how awful it is, because that's going to elicit emotion from you to understand the depth of the sacrifice. But also, don't get thinking too hard about it. Just understand that the sacrifice happened and it was ultimately for the good of everyone involved. While Roberts is exploring this trail, he also comes across many groups of Mormons doing trek, which we have talked about at length here on the Girls Camp podcast. Trek, in a nutshell, is cosplaying this. It's cosplaying the handcart pioneers, because you're not taking wagons, you are pulling a handcart over an actual part of the trail that these people took. Thinking about Roberts having learned all of this horrific stuff and then coming to watch the Mormons doing their trek, he just describes so well how odd that is. He says, they were costumed to the teeth in period outfits, and they exuded a Sunday picnic exuberance that seemed strangely at odds with the somber chapter of history they were reliving. Indeed, it is very odd. And having done trek myself, having gotten the getup and pulled a handcart, yeah, there were certain elements of like, oh, like how hard this must be. We crossed a river and thought about, oh, how hard it would be to cross a river. But we were doing it in the middle of summer with like Gatorade. These people were doing it in the dead of winter during a blizzard with no shoes, already extremely malnourished. And so the comparison that we were trying to play out just immediately feels very bizarre compared to what actually happened and what these people actually experienced. And it almost feels like an additional layer of disregarding and maybe even disrespecting the gravity of what these people actually experienced to just like dress up as a Mormon teenager and like kind of go have like a weird, fun time dressed as a pioneer. Fun is maybe a stretch, but you get my point. At one point, David Roberts ends up sitting down with a group that's doing trek, because the museums that you're visiting along the way, you end up seeing some of those when you're doing trek. Like a lot of times those are the start off point for the groups who are doing trek. And so he's kind of, seeing people come in and out. And at one point he ends up sitting amongst a ward who is doing trek. And they begin talking about with this missionary there, the crossing of the Sweetwater, which was a big Mormon thing that I learned about, that one of the companies made it to the Sweetwater River. It was freezing cold and people were struggling to cross the river. And 3 18-year-old boys ended up all day walking back and forth, carrying people, old people, women, children, across the river. And it was just this massive, heroic effort that these people did that. And then apparently Brigham Young ended up hearing about them and was like sobbing when he heard about them. And apparently they all died within a couple of years after that due to the exposure from that event. Well, Roberts looked into that and pretty much it's entirely a myth. Like there's probably some truth to the fact that people were helping people across, but there was no 3 18-year-olds that like died immediately after. That just didn't happen. So Roberts says, a little later, one of the West Valley women, so West Valley is just a place in Utah, and that was where this group of Mormons were from who were doing trek, repeated the story about the 3 18-year-olds carrying the saints across the Sweetwater. I could not bite my tongue. That's a myth, I blurted out. Chad Orton has written a paper that completely debunks the story. It didn't happen. This was not welcome news to the West Valley ward. An awkward silence ensued as I began to feel like a drunken guest at a party who had just committed some unforgivable faux pas. How do we know what's really the truth? Asked Trish Ward in conciliatory tones. I started to utter some piety of my own about relying on authentic primary sources, but instead, a young woman who had previously spoken not a word mused out loud, maybe we could pray. maybe we could pray. Let's just pray about it. Who needs authentic primary sources? The story of the 3 18-year-olds makes us feel good, and maybe let's just pray about it and see if we keep feeling good. And that will be the best way to know the actual historic, factual truth of the Pioneer Crossing. So many things stuck out to me about this whole story and through reading this book, and I've pointed out many of them along the way. I think one of the biggest things that I keep finding myself thinking about, I have become very, very intrigued by my own pioneer ancestry. I do not have pioneers that crossed the plains in handcarts, but I do have pioneers who crossed the plains in wagons. I don't know all that much about them, but I do know that that's the case. And now I am dying to know exactly who they are, how it happened, where they were converted, what their stories are. And it's very ironic that having been out of the church as long as I have, I am just now finding myself really intensely passionate to learn about my pioneer ancestors. I think it's because this has all become really real to me reading this book. These stories have always just been stories, and being able to read primary sources and having this picture painted so vividly, I'm realizing these were actual people who experienced this. And for me, my pioneer ancestors are people who then created the people who created the people who created me. And it's been proven that there is such a thing as like generational trauma that gets passed down. These stories have been passed down, being spoken, but also through my DNA. And I just feel like this urgency to know more about that. But beyond that personal connection of my pioneer ancestry, it also has just taught me so much about the story of Mormonism and the foundation of Mormonism in so many ways being built upon these stories, these things that happened, and these people that experienced these intense traumas, and then were kind of told like, but it's not a big deal anyway, and how that still persists in modern day Mormonism. I think we see in so many ways, and we see it about this story specifically, but we see it throughout a lot of Mormon doctrine and culture. I think there's a really strong sense of sacrifice is good and it's important, and we should be willing and ready to sacrifice at any time for the cause of Mormonism and of pushing Mormonism forward and of securing ours and our family's own eternal salvation. And regardless of what happens to your mental well-being, to your physical well-being along the journey, it's kind of irrelevant, because the most important thing is like sacrificing for that greater cause. I think this story also really shows the cost of blind obedience, and how when you put your faith so squarely in someone or something, you can be setting yourself up for a lot of danger. These people just really believed that Brigham Young was going to do right by them, that the church leaders were going to do right by them, and that if they followed the counsel of the church leaders, they would be okay, not only because the church leaders would take care of them, but because God would take care of them, because that's what the leaders were saying. And that level of obedience, while in one way could be admirable, I suppose, put these people in really terrible situations. And I think it's a big part of why I'm so wary of organized religion generally, is because I just find it super dangerous to put that kind of faith and trust in people who don't even know you personally, and who oftentimes have ulterior motives of economics. I mean, Brigham Young was hugely motivated by finances with all of this. He was motivated by his own need to build up his church, to have that manpower in Utah so that he could keep practicing polygamy. He was very self-interested, I think, and yet these people thought better of him and thought that he actually cared, and it put them in such a bad situation. I've also been thinking a lot about how, we were talking about our pioneers' victims, and I think in some ways they are, but they were also colonizers. They victimized people. I didn't even get into the whole aspect of the indigenous people of the areas and their interactions with indigenous people, and how they ultimately just took over and stole this place from the indigenous peoples at the time. So while they were victims, I think, of church leadership, they were also victimizing and persecuting other groups of people. And there's just this kind of layered situation of victimization and oppression, but it certainly did not end with them. I think the indigenous people of the land were the ones who got screwed over the worst of all, and that's definitely something that needs to be considered in this as well. I will keep you updated if I learn anything new of note or interest about my pioneer ancestry, and I would love to hear from you about yours. I'm sure there are people listening who probably have direct ancestors that were part of the Martin and or Willie Handcart company, and the author also noted in the book how that has become such a badge of honor. Like, I even found myself reading thinking like, oh my gosh, what if one of my ancestors was part of all of this, just because of how intense it is and how like famous and infamous it is. I'm curious if any of you listening, if you have direct ancestors there and what you make of all of this. And ultimately, I just think it was a massive failure on the part of church leadership and the Mormon church. And that seems to be a theme of something that we still recognize to this day, of a self-interested church and church leadership that doesn't seem really, truly, in my opinion, in most instances, to care that much about the people beyond what those people mean to the bolstering and the perpetuation of the organization itself. Thanks for listening. I've been so excited about this episode. I've just really been so caught up in all of this, learning about it and being able to read it and then pulling together this outline. I just feel like I've really immersed myself in this history. And history, I've never been like a big history buff necessarily, which is maybe why I was apathetic towards all of this in my Mormon years, but learning more about Mormon history, I find fascinating even beyond the Mormon deconstruction stuff. It's just a very fascinating history to learn about. And I've dug pretty deep into the Joseph Smith stuff, but just haven't dug as deep into the pioneer stuff. So we'll see what yet awaits me in this niche interest I have right now. But I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you diving in with me. Let me know if you've read the book. Let me know what you're thinking, what you're feeling. And thank you so much for being here. A rating, a review, a comment is always so appreciated if you enjoy listening to the podcast. And you can find me on YouTube, Girls Camp Podcast, Instagram, Girls Camp Podcast, TikTok, Haley Rawl. And if you want some bonus content, head over to patreon.com/girlscamp for 2 extra episodes a month. Thanks for listening. Can't wait to talk to you next week. Bye.